So the blessing of the animals tradition comes to us from St. Francis, who is on this little charm here, which later in the service, if you'd like to pick one up for your animal or for yourself, you're welcome to. St. Francis was an Italian preacher and monk that lived in the 12th and 13th century, and he was raised, his family was really wealthy. His father was a very wealthy business person, and Francis, in his youth, was sort of a typical youth in a wealthy family. He liked to party with his friends. He joined the military and had sort of this carousing type of life until he was injured and he was ill, and he spent some time recovering. And during that time, he was visited by some visions from God. And God came and said, "Rebuild my church." And at first, Francis thought that meant the actual physical church. So he thought, okay, I'm going to do that. And so he went on a pilgrimage back to his home and back to Rome. And along the way, he met a leper, a very poor man who was covered in leprosy. And Francis's heart was so moved with compassion and solidarity with this person, the love of God overtook him, and he knelt down and he kissed the leper's wounds. This is what the legend, how the story goes. And at that moment, he understood that God was saying not just to rebuild his physical church, but more important, to rebuild, to proclaim the gospel in his life, through his life. So one of the things that we like to say, to attribute to St. Francis, is the saying, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. He probably didn't say exactly that. St. Francis was a preacher. He loved to preach, and he also, following in the footsteps of St. Paul, who says in Corinthians, "If I speak in the tongue of angels but have not love, I am just a clanging gong." That's what Francis meant. I could preach the most eloquent sermon there is, but if my life does not exhibit the love of God, if my life does not show the gospel in all actions, then it's nothing. So Francis came back to town, and he had given away all his family riches on his way. And his father was not super happy with him about that when he got back. And his father actually called him to account in front of the town square and brought the town magistrate and demanded that his son come back to his rightful place in the family and repay this money that he'd given away. And Francis was so filled with the love of God, he said, "Fine, if you think all of that belongs to you, so does my clothes." And he ripped off his clothes. In the middle of the street, he's standing naked in the street, and he says, "I'm of service to God alone." So the radicalness of Francis began early, and that kind of solidarity with the poor was not part of Christian tradition at the time. The church right then was very wealthy, very connected with the establishment. So to say that what it means to follow Christ is to be in solidarity with the poor was a radical thing. Today, we remember another radical thing that Francis did. Francis also spoke about how all creatures, that humans are animals like other animals, and we are in community with other creatures as creations of God, and that we are called to be brothers and sisters with our animal siblings. And the story goes that the very first blessing of the animals, or tradition has it, that Francis was beginning in his ministry, and he was out in the garden, and maybe he was having second thoughts, or maybe he was praying to God saying, "Really, is this really what you called me to do? Should I have done what my father did?" And he was thinking and contemplating and meditating, and he was moved or distracted by this flock of birds that was in the tree, and he was listening to them, and he was so moved by their song that he began to preach to them and say to them, "Birds, sister birds, your song is beautiful, but it needs to be a praise to God." And so he began to preach the animals that the animal's job, just like the human's job, is to live your life in thanksgiving and praise to God. And so that began his ministry of bringing in animals into the family of what we are to be concerned about. There's all kinds of traditions about that. There's a legend that there was a wolf in the town of Gubbio that was threatening the town, and the wolf was killing livestock and was began to threaten people, and they were going to try and do something about the wolf, and Francis said, no, I'll go talk to the wolf. So he goes and he meets with the wolf, and he says, "Brother wolf." And he talks to the wolf, and he asks the wolf to confess and to convert. and which is pretty radical, right? To talk to an animal about confessing and converting, and as if the animal might have a soul. And I don't know if Francis actually said that, but maybe he did. And so the wolf repented and became friends with the countryside. The other tradition we have is that Francis was the very first to enact a live nativity scene. So nativity is what happens at Christmas time when we have the little creche that has the manger and the little sheep and the oxen and the baby Jesus. And the story is that Francis was visiting a countryside in Italy, and the chapel was too small to hold the midnight mass. And so he wanted to have the midnight mass outside, but he thought that folks were really sort of missing the majesty and the magnificence and the kind of the visceral nature of that first nativity. And so he created a manger. He brought straw. He got an ox, a donkey, a cow, some sheep, and he actually reenacted a live nativity. On and on and on, the story goes about Francis's love of creatures. Towards the end of his life, he wrote this song, this poem called the Canticle. Sometimes it's called the Canticle of the Sun or the Canticle of the Creatures. Some of you may be familiar with it. And in that song, he talks about brother moon, sister sun, brother water, siblings with all created beings. So I'm going to invite those of you who brought animals or have a photo of an animal, or you can even just tell us a story about your animal. If you have an animal in your heart or with you in body to be blessed, I will invite you to come up and form a circle, and Phil and Kit and Laura and I will offer a blessing. And all of us can use this moment to recommit ourselves to care for and be responsible for creating a world where all creatures can be safe and healthy, that we advocate for laws and for climates where they can grow and thrive, and that we remember to give thanks for all the living beings in our lives that help us remember the goodness of God. I invite all of you who have animals that you would like to be blessed to come and form a circle.